Hello, these are flipped notes 8-1, and we've made it to Unit 8 on clinical psychology. This is our introduction to mental disorders and the DSM-5. My Bitmoji is keeping it simple this unit, and we'll have the same one throughout. And she's wearing a green ribbon, which is the color for mental health awareness. And I've got my End of the Stigma mental health awareness t-shirt on as well. So let's get started. So psychological disorders are quite common in the US and throughout the world. If you're not experiencing one yourself, it's very likely that you know somebody who does. Approximately one in five adults experience mental illness in a given year, and 1 in 25 of those are experiencing a serious mental illness. These stats and a lot of the information that I'll use throughout this chapter comes from the source of NAMI.org, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, a great source for information. These disorders, many like depression and schizophrenia, exist in all cultures across the world. So it's not just phenomena in America. But how do we determine what is abnormal behavior? And that's something that has continued to change in psychology throughout history, because we've all behaved abnormally, but at what point does it become a mental illness? Who says when our behavior is so abnormal that maybe we even have to be detained for it? So we'll talk about that. When it comes to identifying abnormal behaviors, we look at three main attributes. There's really five here, but the first three are the main ones. Is it deviant? Is it distressing? Is it dysfunctional? And then we can also add in dangerous and unjustifiable. So deviant, don't just associate that with something bad. Deviant means that it goes against the norm of behavior. And sometimes that can be different by culture, that what's acceptable in some cultures is not acceptable in others. And that's also what's changed disorders over time. For example, in the very first version of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, homosexuality was classified as a mental illness because it was deviant. It was considered very abnormal and against the norm of behavior. And now it is very much not in the DSM as a disorder. To be considered a disorder, some behavior has to be distressful, that it causes the person or others around them distress, that it is disturbing them. It's dysfunctional, and this is a big one that we'll talk about. That does it actually interfere with your daily life? Does it keep you from living a normal life? Is it dangerous? Can this behavior cause harm to self or others? And is it unjustifiable? So, for example, there's depression related to grieving, and that is justifiable. But then there's depression that does not have that kind of source, and that can be considered unjustifiable. Looking at the history of psychological disorders and treatment of them, we'll talk about this more in a later section with treatment. But ancient treatments were not so great. Included trephination, boring holes in the skulls to remove evil forces, exorcism, being caged like animals, beaten, burned, castrated, mutilated, transfused with animal's blood. We've come a long way. Today, psychology uses and psychiatry uses what's called the medical model. The medical model is the idea that we can diagnose symptoms, we can look for symptoms, diagnose an illness. We're going to look at the cause and history of an illness, what we call the etiology, and then we're also going to look for a prognosis. What's the probable course of an illness? But it's just generally the idea that mental illness can be diagnosed and treated kind of in the same way as a physical illness. That may include therapy or treatment in a psychiatric hospital. We've talked about the idea of the biopsychosocial approach all year long, and it definitely applies to disorders here. The modern psychology is going to, when we're looking at causes of disorders, we're looking at the biological influences. That's a huge thing today in psychology. Looking at brain structure and chemistry, genes, evolution, psychological influences, stress, trauma, learned helplessness, mood related perceptions and memories, and then social culture influences, expectations, and then what's considered normality. So all of those add to make up the biopsychosocial approach. We've talked about perspectives all year, so let's take a quick look at how each perspective views disorders. The psychoanalytic, we know this is Freudian, and everything has to do with the unconscious mind, unresolved childhood conflicts. So it says to understand roots of disorder, we do need to look at the person's early life history. Behavioral says that our behaviors, including mental health disorders, are learned responses, and that our behaviors have been reinforced, and that's continuing the behavior. Cognitive believes that our thoughts and our feelings are the root of psychological problems, and the only way to fix the behaviors to change those thoughts and beliefs. Let's see, the humanistic perspective says that disorders are because people are responsible for their own behavior, including abnormal behavior. So it focuses on the relationship between individuals and society and how people view themselves in relation to others. Believes that disorders don't have, believe disordered individuals don't have self worth, have conditions of worth placed upon them. And then sociocultural believes that abnormal behavior is shaped by our family, our society, and our culture. So your relationship with others can support and even sometimes cause your abnormal behaviors. And that the stress in our life that we encounter really influences the disorders that we have or don't have. So our big kind of topic here in this section is the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I don't actually have a copy to show you because it's a really expensive book. It's huge. It's been updated multiple times, and we're currently on the DSM-5, the 5th version. This is put out by the American Psychiatric Association to describe psychological disorders. Come a long way. The original one compared 60 disorders in the 1950s, and now they're up to around 400 disorders. So different goals are to describe, it describes symptoms. It does not really go much into treatment because that's not exactly what that's for, but it's more to describe the symptoms of these and indicate how prevalent the disorder is. It helps us to keep reliability. Remember, reliability is consistency, so that the diagnosis by one professional will be similar to a diagnosis of other professionals. Before the DSM, most people were diagnosed with terms like neurosis and psychosis. Neurotics were people with mental conditions, but they still remained connected with reality. You'd say you're neurotic. So, neurotic would probably be today related to things like anxiety, depression, and OCD. Psychotic were those people who had lost touch with reality. So, they may be having delusions, hallucinations. So, we associate that with more severe disorders like schizophrenia. So those are not actual diagnoses anymore, but those terms do still stick around, especially when we're labeling different types of symptoms as neurotic or psychotic symptoms. So, what about labeling psychological disorders? Critics argue that when we do that, that we're stigmatizing individuals. So, there's pros and cons of creating the label for a disorder. That when we have the label, we can identify it, and we can identify symptoms, and we can identify treatments. Insurance people, they want us to identify everything, but you also create a stigma and people have an expectation of how that label is supposed to act, and that may not be the case for everybody. So an example of the danger of labeling is David Rosenhahn's experiment. It was done in 1973, and then he wrote an article about it called Being Sane in Insane Places, and it's also known as the THUD experiment. I'll explain why here in just a second. So in Rosenhahn's experiment, he wanted to show that psychiatric hospitals were really having a hard time identifying and labeling people who were truly mentally ill. So in his study, he had 8 pseudo patients. They were professional and adult, educated men and women, but they were posing as different types, having different types of jobs. And they faked their way into different mental hospitals. So in order to get into the hospital, they were reporting that they were hearing voices. And all of them said the same things, that the voices were saying things like thud, 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 and empty and hollow. And then once they were let into the hospital, they acted totally normal. They dropped any kind of symptoms that they had been showing before. Most of them were admitted and diagnosed as schizophrenic. Some of them were there for as little as 7 days, and others for as long as 52 days. And most of them were given some kind of medication, over 2,000 pills between the group, which they flushed down the toilet. And apparently, lots of the patients did, and nobody seemed to care. None of the doctors actually knew that these people were pseudo patients or that they were fake patients. However, they reported that a lot of the other patients were very suspicious of them. So when this got out to the world, it was, like, oh my goodness, they can't tell once you get in whether you're sane or insane. And it had to do with that label. We also don't use that term insane uh, in the way that they used it back then, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, and also in class. So he said it's clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. So this just really emphasized the need for something like the DSM to distinguish between real symptoms that they could actually look for and others that are not real. Insanity is actually a legal term. So when we talk about the insanity defense in legal terms, it means that at the time of a crime, you were unable to control your behaviors because of a mental disorder. But that insanity label raises moral and ethical questions about society and how we treat those who have disorders and crimes. We'll talk a little bit about Ted Kaczynski or the Unabomber and the insanity defense in class. But if you want to know more about that, you need to take a forensics class because I think they talk about that in there. The labels can be helpful for healthcare professionals communicating with one another and establishing therapy. These are the categories the DSM-5 identifies for mental disorders: anxiety, depressive, bipolar and related, obsessive compulsive and related, trauma and stressor related, dissociative, somatic symptom and related, feeding and eating, neurodevelopment, schizophrenia spectrum, and other psychotic and personality disorders. You don't need to write all those down. But it's changed over time that they've grouped some together. OCD used to be included under anxiety, and now the OCD related disorders have their own entire category. Same thing for trauma and stressor disorders. Those used to be under anxiety, and now they have their own category. So as we learn more about stuff, the DSM is probably just going to keep getting bigger because we keep learning more and more information. Some more stats here from NAMI real quick, just showing the prevalence of mental illness. For your age group, approximately 1 in 5 experiences a severe mental disorder. For children aged 8 through 15, the estimate is 13%. We'll talk about the prevalence of schizophrenia, but it's approximately 1% of the population in the US. About 20.2 million in the US who experience substance use disorder. And the other thing I wanted to show you here, though, is of those people who have a substance use disorder, about half of them had a co-occurring mental illness. So that tells us that a lot of people are self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. So big important unit here. And sometimes information is triggering, and it's my goal not to do that to you, but you're going to see yourself in a lot of what we talk about in these next few sections. And I just want you to remember that when we talk about abnormal behavior is rooted in normal behavior. So it is normal to see yourself when we talk about anxiety and OCD and these, because we all feel those things. But it's when it becomes a disorder, when it reaches those deviant, distressing, dysfunctional, dangerous, unjustifiable levels. But if at any time, you feel like you really truly are identifying yourself with these things that we're talking about, then maybe you do need to reach out for help. I'm there for you, and if I can't help you, then I'll direct you to some other people on our campus who can. That's it for Flipped Notes 8-1.